Hello, welcome back to another lesson for Book of Mormon 121. My name is Dr. Jan Martin, and I get to teach you Mosiah chapters 7 through 24 in this lesson, which I'm very excited about. We're going to cover Abinadi some more, and then we're going to look at Alma and some adversity, and hopefully help us all to handle our adversity a little bit better. So let's jump in as usual, reminding ourselves of where we are on the map. As I taught you last time, we have Nephites up north in Zarahemla now, and we have the Lamanites taking over the southern portion of the lands down there. But in the middle of Lamanite territory is this little colony of Nephites who went down there under Zeniff during the reign of King Benjamin, and they were gone several decades before the Nephites actually went down there to find them and see what was going on. So in this particular section, we're going to be looking at King Noah and King Limhi. King Limhi is King Noah's son, and kind of some of the differences between those two and what happens to these people. I will show you on the map as they're moving around where everybody's going so you can follow along and not be lost. But for now, we're going to jump back into that little white circle and keep examining the colony of Nephites living there. Last time we got you through the trial of Abinadi, and he closes his testimony there in chapter 16 by focusing on the Redeemer. And then we're going to get the storyline. So if you jump over to chapter 17, we have 1 through 5-ish, exposes you to Alma the priest, who is touched by what Abinadi has to say. And he's actually chased out of the area. Noah sends his guards to kill Alma. Alma escapes. And then he repents, Alma, and he sits and hides and writes down all the words of Abinadi. So we're really glad about all of that. So verses 1 through 4. Verse 5, the king obviously is not happy with what Abinadi has said. And so he has him thrown back into prison. And then verse 6 tells you about those 3 days of waiting. And scholars think that this 3 days of waiting is the Feast of Pentecost taking place. And that's why they're not doing any more official business, as they're honoring the festival. So then when the 3 days are over, you come down to verse 7, they pull him out of prison. They say they found an accusation, and they're going to put him to death. So let's have a look at verse 8. Thou hast said that God himself should come down among the children of men. And we know that Jehovah is that God. But these guys are taking exception to that. They don't believe Jehovah's going to come down. They don't see a need for a redeemer. They've never been teaching about a redeemer. And they think that the law of Moses can save without a redeemer. And so you can see their doctrinal issues here and why they would want to accuse Abinadi of blasphemy. In the law of Moses, there's only a few capital crimes, and blasphemy is one of them. And they could put him to death for that. Now, I do want to point out in verse 8, the way Abinadi can get out of this is to recall all the words which thou hast spoken evil concerning Noah and his people. So you can actually see the hypocrisy there. This isn't really about blasphemy. This is about saying things that have offended the king and his people. So let's look at verse 9. Abinadi said unto him, I say unto you, I will not recall the words which I have spoken unto you concerning this people, for they are true. And that ye may know of their surety, I have suffered myself that I have fallen into your hands. Verse 10, yea, I will suffer even until death. And I will not recall my words, and they shall stand as a testimony against you. And if ye slay me, you will shed innocent blood, and this shall also stand as a testimony against you at the last day. So it's important to point out the two witnesses. We always have the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Abinadi's words and Abinadi's death are going to be those two witnesses against these people. So please have a look at verse 11. King Noah feels the power of that, and he's about to release Abinadi. He's afraid. But watch in verse 12. The priests lifted up their voices against him and began to accuse him, saying, he has reviled the king. Therefore the king was stirred up in anger against him, and he delivered him up that he might be slain. I call this a peer pressure moment. King Noah was going to do the right thing. And then his friends led him astray. His friends stirred him up into anger. His friends knew him well enough, and they knew how to push the buttons. And they wanted Abinadi dead. And they manipulate the king into that with this peer pressure moment. So I always like to stop and talk to my students about what kind of friends do you have, and are they the type that are going to help you do the right thing, or are they the type that are going to encourage you and pressure you to do the wrong things? So it's really good to think about who are you surrounding yourself with, and what type of influence do they have on you. Now let's have a look at Abinadi's death. This is quite a fascinating read, and I'd just like to use some of our exegesis, which is carefully looking at the text and considering what the words say, and I hope to open up some other ideas for you about maybe how Abinadi died. So let's look at verse 13. It came to pass that they took him and bound him and scourged his skin with faggots, yea, even unto death. And now when the flames began to scorch him, he cried unto them, saying, Behold, even as ye have done unto me, so shall it come to pass that thy seed shall cause that many shall suffer the pains that I do suffer, even the pains of death by fire. And this because they believe in the salvation of the Lord their God. And so if you read 16 through 20, you'll see more teaching there and the prophecies of how other people are going to be put to death. And then verse 20, and now Abinadi had said these words, he fell, having suffered death by fire. And so let's talk about the words that you see there that are contributing to Abinadi's death. So I like to use an 1828 dictionary because that is the language of Joseph Smith. And so we can understand maybe a little bit about the way Joseph is understanding what's going on as he's translating. So we see some things happening to Abinadi. The first word I want you to look at is scourged. If you don't know what scourged means, it has a particular meaning. It means to whip, to lash, to afflict greatly, to harass, torment, or injure. Hopefully you'll think of Jesus Christ, who was scourged before he was crucified, and the Romans whipped him, and whipped him severely. And so scourging typically has a connotation of being whipped or lashed or struck with something. Then we have these faggots. Most of us don't know what the non-offensive meaning of that word is, and it does have another meaning. It means a bundle of sticks, twigs, or small branches of trees. And so when you put those two things together and then you add the fire, you've got to think, well, this maybe is not a typical burning at the stake. That's how most of us envision Abinadi's death. But when we actually read the text more carefully, we see that maybe there's something else going on here. And so I'd just like to introduce you to some scholarship that's looked at the ethnographic sources from pre- and post-Columbia American indigenous groups. And they have found a particular type of torture that actually matches this description very well. So we know Abinadi was bound, and in this type of torture, captives are bound to a physical structure so that they can't run away. And then you go up to them personally, and you have a lit firebrand, which is made out of a bundle of sticks, and it's lit on fire. And you go up to the person, and you strike them with your firebrand. And so you're burning them from the inside out, or from the outside in. And it's really personal, and it's really dreadful torture. And you could actually slowly kill someone this way for hours, days, or even weeks sometimes. And so just keep in mind that this may be the way Abinadi was murdered, and not just tying him to a stake and lighting some wood on fire, which is what we typically think. So here is an image of some of the images we have of these practices happening in pre- and post-Columbia America. So I just want to show you some of the things that Robert J. Matthews has said when he discovered this kind of torture practice, and other scholars have taken those ideas and found more research and more things to do. So there's some good articles out there. But Robert Matthews says that this passage we've just read seems to say that Abinadi's tormentors took burning torches and poked him with these, burning his skin until he died. In my mind, I see Abinadi bound, possibly supported by something, and his fiendish executioners, probably the priests, gathered about him with burning torches, those faggots in their hands, jabbing him and rubbing him with these until they caused him to die. They actively, eagerly, and physically caused his death. I can imagine them dancing and cavorting about Abinadi and hear them shouting, exulting, and gloating over what they were doing. So this way of reading the text just opens it up a little bit and helps you see that there may be something worse going on here. Burning at the stake is bad enough, but to make this so personal and to make it so close to Abinadi, one of the other things we want to point out to you is Abinadi is able to talk to the priest while this is going on. And a burning at the stake, there's so much smoke usually that you can't talk anymore, and the fumes are what contribute to your death. And so we don't really have that concept of all those fumes there. And so here's Abinadi potentially being tortured for hours, days, potentially longer, and eventually succumbing to his burns and injuries in this terrible way. So I just want to pause and have you think about Abinadi's courage, especially in verse 10, when he says, I am not going to recall my words, and I will suffer even until death. He probably had a good idea what his death would be like and the courage it would have taken to face that torture and to face this horrible experience and not take back your words and not apologize so you could get out of it. Learn from Abinadi. He's a hero, a courageous hero, standing up for what's right. If you look at the end of verse 20, Mormon, who's recording this, says, having been put to death because he would not deny the commandments of God, having sealed the truth of his words by his death. So I hope that helps you appreciate Abinadi more and gives you another way of thinking about the way that he died so we can be grateful for his example. Now, as I said, Alma believes and defends Abinadi. He tried to get him off. He's chased away. He hides. He repents. And he is now going to set up a church. So if you'll come to chapter 18, verses 1 through 3, you'll see all of that, okay? He starts quietly teaching, and he starts having success. And so if Alma is Abinadi's only convert, Alma does a great job then spreading the word, and people are responding very well to Alma. And he sets up a church. I am going to cover these baptismal covenants here, but just not right now. So don't panic. We're not going to jump over baptismal covenants that quickly, but I want to save them and put them into a different part of the story so that you can appreciate them maybe in a different way. So if you come in chapter 18 to 30 through 34, you see Noah finding out about this new church, and he sends his troops to execute Alma and his people. And they are led away by the Lord to escape this destruction, and they're going to leave. Now, I often get questions from my students. Where does Alma get this priesthood authority to set up a church? How's that working? Isn't Alma apostate? Like, what's happening here? And so let's take a minute so we can talk about Alma's priesthood. So to do that, you need to go back to Mosiah chapter 11, verse 5. And we'll look at the priestly line amongst this colony of where it came from. So verse 5 tells us something interesting. This is Noah when he becomes king, and he starts changing things around. And it says he put down all the priests that had been consecrated by his father. At this particular time in Nephite government, we have them being led by these priestly kings. Mosiah the first, King Benjamin, and then Mosiah the second. They all have the kingdom and the right to rule the kingdom, as well as the religious power to be the priests. So there are these priestly kings that are able to give priesthood power. It appears that Zeniff is also one of these kings for his colony, that he's a king that has the political power as well as the priestly power, and that he shared that priestly power with consecrated priests who were then supposed to teach the law of Moses. So you watch Noah, who's probably been set apart as a priestly king and who has this authority, taking away all of his father's priests and putting in new ones so that they will support him in his wickedness. So clearly there's priesthood authority amongst the people of Zeniff, and it seems to be legitimate that it came from the Nephites when Zeniff came down. So Alma was probably set apart as a priest by Noah, and so he had priesthood authority. As most of you know, it is possible to have priesthood authority, but not be worthy of it, to not be living your life in a way that allows you to have any kind of priesthood power. So your authority is there, but you can't use it in a powerful way because you're living wickedly. So this may be what happened to Alma, that he had authority, but he was unworthy, and then he needed to repent. As soon as he repented, then he can have access to this priesthood power that he's going to need as he sets up this church. So come to Mosiah 23. I'd like to show you how important this priestly authority is to Alma, that he seems to recognize it, and that suggests that he had it and understands it. So if you look in chapter 23 at 16 and 17, later on, when Alma's left, he's setting up an organization, and he says that he doesn't want anyone teaching or preaching who's not been set apart. So here's Alma in verse 16. He was their high priest, he being the founder of their church, which suggests he had the authority to do that. And it came to pass that none received authority to preach or to teach except it were by him from God. So somewhere in here, God is either acknowledging Alma's priesthood or has given it to him in some other way so that he has it. And then Alma, in verse 17, consecrated all their priests and all their teachers, and none were consecrated except they were just men. So we can see a clear priesthood authority chain here. It's either coming through Zeniff and Noah, or God has somehow come in and given Alma the priesthood that way. Doesn't really matter, but we know that Alma's priesthood is there and that God is recognizing it. So before we leave King Noah, let's wind down his life really quick. If you come in chapter 19 of Mosiah, you'll see what happens to King Noah. Gideon is a member of the court and seems to hold some responsibility. He's mad at King Noah. In 1 through 6, you'll see him chasing him up the tower, threatening to kill him. And so when he's up at the top of the tower, he sees an army of Lamanites coming, and he begs Gideon not to kill him and says, I need to protect my people. So Gideon lets him off. He runs down the tower, and then Noah runs away. He doesn't actually protect his people. He takes everybody and leaves and is running into the wilderness. And because things are going so slowly, if you'll come in verses 9 through 12 of chapter 19, you'll see him commanding all of his men to leave their wives and children behind. They're just too slow. We don't care. Let's just go. In verse 12, many of the Nephite men refused to do that, and they stayed with their wives and children, which is great. And then those who went with King Noah, they get in a little bit of an argument here on what's going on. I imagine the leaving behind of the women and children was a real issue for the ones that followed him, and they get angry. And so in 2021, you see King and them having an altercation about whether they should go back or not, and the people get mad at the king, and they suffer to put him to death by fire. My students ask me, do you think they put him to death the same way that he put Abinadi to death? Very likely. Now, this form of torture can take time, but it can also be done quickly, and so maybe they just got all their little torches and things and just really took Noah out quite quickly. They were going to kill the priest as well in verse 21, but the priests somehow escape and run into the wilderness. And so here we have the Nephites who've just gotten rid of King Noah, returning to the body of Nephites who stayed behind, hoping that there's something to come back to. The Nephites that had stayed were put into bondage, into slavery under King Limhi, who is Noah's son, and he submits to the Lamanites, and all of his people are put in bondage. And so this is the state that we're in chapter 19. So let's have a look at the map again to remind you. We've been looking at this little colony of Nephites right there in the white. And now we've had some people moving around, and so I want to track them for you. So Alma's people left under King Noah, and they moved over to Helam. So we're going to follow them in just a minute over to Helam and see what happens to them. As you just found out, the priests run away, and they establish themselves in the land of Amulon. Now, we're not going to cover this story, but most of you know the priests take new wives. They kidnap a bunch of Lamanite women and drag them away and marry them and have them in the land of Amulon. So just keep in mind that that story's in the background. But hopefully now you can see we have three little groups of Nephites. We have Limhi's people in the white circle. We have Alma's people with the blue star in Helam, and then we have the Nephite priests over there in Amulon. And we're going to follow the people of Alma to Helam. Now, as we jump into this section of looking at Alma's people, I just want to start off by talking about principles of adversity so that we can really appreciate what's going on with Alma's people a little bit better. So Elder Richard G. Scott made the following statement. No one wants adversity. Trials, disappointments, sadness, and heartache come to us from two basically different sources. Those who transgress the laws of God will always have those challenges. The other reason for adversity is to accomplish the Lord's own purposes in our life, that we may receive the refinement that comes from testing. So Richard G. Scott's just going to simplify it for us and say that there's two forms of adversity. Adversity that comes from our transgressions and adversity that comes because we're willing to need to grow. So let me show you another witness. Elder Maxwell does a similar thing, except he's going to give us three types of adversity. He says there's one type that comes from our own sins and mistakes. Type 2, trials that happen because this is a fallen world, and you can't really blame anybody for these ones. They're just part of mortality. And then type 3, trials that God is willing for us to experience because he wants us to grow. So what do we do with Elder Scott and Elder Maxwell? I'm just going to show you that Elder Scott is making one group out of these two types. And so they're basically teaching the same thing. Elder Maxwell's being a little bit more specific, but Elder Scott is saying trials come from our sins and weaknesses, and then he's merging type 2 and type 3 into one. So they're essentially teaching the same concepts, that there are two types of trials, ones we bring on ourselves, and the other ones that happen because we're in mortality and need to grow. So Elder Maxwell said, to pretend that the boundary lines between types of suffering can be drawn with clinical precision and that demarcation is possible in all circumstances would be a mistake. Moreover, the interplay between the various forms of suffering makes them interactive. But even so, there is a certain utility in being able to distinguish between the pain that is self-inflicted and the pain which is not. And this is exactly what Elder Scott's going to do. He says it's vitally important for each of us to identify from which of these two sources come our trials and challenges, for the corrective action is very different. So as we have adversity, it's really important that we sit down and think about this. Why am I having this? Because what I do to correct the adversity is going to be very different depending on what type of adversity I've got here. So Elder Scott goes on to say, just when all seems to be going right, challenges often come in multiple doses applied simultaneously. When those trials are not consequences of your disobedience, they are evidence that the Lord feels you are prepared to grow more. He therefore gives you experiences that stimulate growth, understanding, and compassion, which polish you for your everlasting benefit. To get you from where you are to where he wants you to be requires a lot of stretching, and that generally entails discomfort and pain. So let's do what Elder Scott and Elder Maxwell are suggesting we do. When a trial comes, let's stop and think about why it's there. A good question to ask is, did I bring this on myself in some way? If the answer is yes, then we can say, well, what did I do? Did I do something wrong? Was I selfish? Was I insensitive? Was I a procrastinator? Was I unkind or judgmental towards someone? Did I make a poor decision? Did I rebel? What's going on here? And if I can figure that out, then the automatic correction is to repent. Just go and make it right. Do your part to make the situation right, and then that trial can become something that you put an end to because you've changed and you've made it right with people and you've gone and fixed it. And so then I'm done with that trial and we're good. Now, if I ask this question, did I bring this on myself in some way? And the answer is no. Then suddenly I can see it as a polishing, growing experience. So I'm just going to tell you a quick personal story. One day when I was in my mid-20s, I got a phone call from my mother, and the first thing she said when I answered the phone was, "Are you sitting down?" And I'm like, "No," but whenever anybody says that to you, you kind of get the idea that you're going to hear some bad news. So I said, "I will sit down." And so I did, and then I said, what are you calling about? Why are you asking me to sit down? And she said, "Well, I've just come back from the doctor, and I have been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer." And so, of course, that was pretty difficult news to hear. And so we had a long talk about what the doctor said and about her medical treatments and what they were going to do to try and rid her of this cancer. And she had a lot to go through. So it was pretty rough time. But this is a good illustration of a trial coming on me that was out of the blue, wasn't something I was expecting. And when I asked myself, did I bring this on myself in some way, I could honestly say no. I was not responsible for my mother's cancer. I didn't do anything to cause it. I didn't, contribute to the situation. It was just something that happened. And so I could sit there and see that this was clearly a polishing experience that was there, that the Lord was giving our family to help us improve. And so we had to face this cancer diagnosis very bravely. And as we did so, a lot of things had to change in our family and improve, which was the point. So that's an example of how can I tell the difference between these two things. And if I can't find something I've done that contributed to my adversity, then I know that it's a growth experience and I'm supposed to be developing some qualities. And that will help me submit to the trial a little bit more positively. So now that we understand this, let's go look at Alma's people and watch them getting involved with some adversity and see if they can figure out what type of adversity is this. Does it have something to do with them, or is this one of these growth experiences? So everybody come over to Mosiah 23. I would like to have a look at verses 19 through 21. If you remember, they've repented, they've joined the church, they've made baptismal covenants, they moved, and they're now in this other location. So verse 19 tells us, "And it came to pass that they," Alma's people, "began to prosper exceedingly in the land. And they called the land Helam. And it came to pass that they did multiply and prosper exceedingly in the land of Helam, and they built a city, which they called the city of Helam." But here we go. Here's that word, nevertheless, in verse 21. "The Lord seeth fit to chasten his people, yea, he trieth their patience and their faith." So here we go. The people are doing well. They're repented. They've moved. They're living the gospel. They're having prosperity. Everything is going well. And suddenly, out of the blue, is going to come a growth experience with the purpose of developing their patience and their faith. So let's look at how they handle an unexpected adversity that comes in the form of a Lamanite army. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video for a minute so that you can have fun reading verses 25 through 29 and 36 through 39, looking for the answer to the question I posed. How can I handle experiences that are designed for my growth based on what I see the people of Alma doing? So they're going to have the Lamanite army come into town, and I'd just like you to look at how they respond initially to the adversity that's suddenly there. So if you want to pause and read and underline things that you find that answer my question, that would be great. And so I'll let you do that. Now, with my students, after they've done some searching, I let them point things out. And so I'm just going to point out a few things. These are not all the things that you could have found in these verses, but there's some really good ones. And so if you look at verse 26, after they've seen this army of the Lamanites in verse 25, it says, "It came to pass that the brethren of Alma fled from their fields and gathered themselves together." So one of the very first things you can do with an unexpected piece of adversity is to gather with people who can support you. Sometimes we keep our pains and troubles and problems to ourselves because we think we can handle them on our own. But you watch Alma's people wisely coming together. They're all going to be affected by this Lamanite army, and they need to be able to support one another. So principle number 1, gather, support. Get people with me who can support me. That's what my mother did when she got her cancer diagnosis. She told us all, and we could all kind of circle the wagons and try and be supportive of her. Now, if you look at verse 27, you watch Alma's reaction, okay? He stands among them and he recognizes that they're scared. And he says that they should not be frightened, but that they should do something else. They should remember the Lord their God and he would deliver them. So one of the principles my students love to point out is adversity often causes fear. And so I like to stop and talk to my students. What kind of fears do you have when you're having adversity? I often hear things like, well, it feels like nothing's ever going to be the same. Or what if my family member like me with my mother and her cancer, what if she dies? Like, how am I going to handle that? There's a reason to be scared about that future, a future without your mother on the scene. And so there's lots of things that we could be scared about when adversity comes. Do I have the ability to handle this? You imagine my mother, how am I going to get through chemotherapy and all the surgeries and radiations and things I need to have? Do I have the strength and stamina to do that? So we have lots of reasons to be scared, but Alma directs them to a position of faith, that they remember the Lord their God. That's remembering the covenants that you've made, that he would deliver us. That's one of the parts of his promises to us, is that he won't abandon us and he'll help us. You look at verse 28, look at what they do. They hush their fears, and they turn right to praying. And so we like to talk about that. How quickly are you praying when adversity comes? How soon do you turn to the Lord, or is he kind of down the list and you tell everyone else and then he's kind of on the end there? And so those are just some of the things that you could have found in there. I do want to point out verses 36 through 39. These are important as well. I believe that Alma's trying to solve the problem of the Lamanite army, and the most immediate solution is to get them out of town. So how do we do that? We promise to show them the way out of town. Now, it's not Alma's fault that the Lamanites don't keep their promise to leave. But as you can see, when adversity comes, I should be trying to apply solutions that I can see to try and solve the problem. Even if they don't work, I have an obligation to participate in that. And Alma keeps his honor, and he does the right thing, and he's trying to solve the problem. But Lamanites move in. If you look at the end of verse 38, they bring their wives and their children, and they're coming to stay. And a person named Amulon, who is one of the priests, is appointed to be a ruler over that area. And as you'll find out, he doesn't like Alma. And so things are going to get worse. So this experience helps you see how to handle adversity when it initially arises in your life. Now let's watch what happens when the adversity continues. What do these people do when their situation gets worse and when it hasn't changed or gotten any better? So again, if you'd like to pause the video and read Mosiah 24, 10 through 17, you can then search for what did Alma's people do when it got really bad, and what does that teach me about what I can do when my adversity is just really, really rough. I'd also like to invite you now to put Mosiah 18, 8 through 11 as a cross-reference for these verses, because baptismal covenants connect here. And I would like you to spend some time studying where you can see Alma 18, 8 through 11 operating in Mosiah 24. And so I'll just let you stop that, and you can do some study. And then when you come back, I can share a few ideas here and some ideas, but they're not the only ones, and you may find things in here that I don't mention that are powerful to you. So as I ask my students, what did you see Alma's people doing when things got worse? Well, we have Amulon coming in and actually putting the Nephites into what we would call slavery. Okay, they say bondage here, but we would use the word slavery. He's putting tasks on them. He's putting guards over them. It's just a complete slavery moment, and they are not having a good time of it. If you look at verse 10, so great were their afflictions that their prayers changed. They're crying mightily to God. But when Amulon sees that, he's like, I'm not letting you do that. So he puts guards over them and prevents them from praying in an obvious way. So Alma and his people, here's a principle for you. When things get really bad in your life, adapt. Adapt what you're doing. They needed to keep praying, but they couldn't do it in their normal way. And so they found a way to just pour out their hearts to God and not have it be obvious to their guards. And so one of the principles you can use is the normal things I do every day may not be enough under adversity, and I may need to adapt and change what I'm doing to help me meet my new circumstances. And so then when you watch the Lord, they're praying to the Lord, and the Lord comes back and says, lift up your heads and be of good comfort. Why? Because I know of the covenant which ye have made unto me, and I will covenant with my people and deliver them out of bondage. This is why I sent you back to Mosiah 18, because I want you to look at what covenants did they make. And when you go back to Mosiah 18 and you were reading about the covenants they made, I'm hoping you'll see the connection. Notice the first part of their baptismal covenant is desiring to be in the fold of God and to be called his people. That's great. So that's the covenant relationship that you have now with Jehovah, is he's going to be my God and I'm going to be his people. There's promises there. But then look at the next thing. I'm willing to bear one another's burdens, that they may be light. Well, you've just seen Alma's people be thrown into a slavery. What an opportunity to bear other people's burdens. Then look at this. 9 are willing to mourn with those that mourn. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of mourning going on when you're in slavery, and a lot of times to need to comfort those that stand in need of comfort. And another time, especially when you've got Amulon around trying to interfere with your religious practices, to somehow find a way to stand a witness of God at all times and in all things and in all places. So I hope you see, as you're looking at this baptismal covenant thing has a huge role to play. As they keep those covenants of helping one another, God will deliver them out of bondage. Then, if you look at verse 14, he says, I will also ease the burdens. So what we see here is the enabling power of the atonement coming in and helping them rise to the occasion of whatever burdens are being placed on their backs. I imagine they have a lot of heavy labor to do, a lot of tasks and things that the Amulon's people are asking them to complete, and they're being treated poorly if they don't complete it. I'd imagine they're not being fed particularly well, as all slaves sometimes are treated like that. And so you can see that they have this. And then you have this right in the middle of verse 14, this lovely reference right back to the baptismal covenant, to stand as a witness for me, that I visit my people in their afflictions. So look at verse 15. As these people keep their covenants, and as they tap into the enabling power of the atonement, look at this. The burdens which were laid upon Alma and his brethren were made light. Now, I don't want to diminish the enabling power of the atonement, because I believe it's operating here and that these people are individually becoming stronger. But I don't want you to miss that one of the reasons the burdens are being made light is because they're keeping their baptismal covenants and helping each other. So this question I asked you, what can I do when things get really bad? I can return to my covenants. I can start keeping my covenants, and I can let other people help me. So that's what we do in the church. We help each other, but some of us are really great at helping. We're just not really great at being helped. And imagine what would happen if these people refused the help that their fellow Nephites were offering, and they'd miss out on this lightening of the burdens. And so we need to learn to not only help, but to be helped and accept help from others. And you can see this miraculous lightening of the load happening both through other people and the enabling power of the atonement. Now remember, the purpose of this trial was to strengthen their patience and their faith. So let's look and see if we can see it happening. Look at verse 16. And it came to pass that so great was their faith, there it is, and their patience, there it is, that the voice of the Lord came unto them again, saying, Be of good comfort, for on the morrow I will deliver you out of bondage. One of the best things you can do when you're having a trial is figure out what it's for. What is God wanting me to develop in with this? And the minute I understand that, I can get to work developing my faith and my patience or whatever other thing the Lord wants you to develop. And then the trial can be brought to an end because it served its purpose. Clearly, the people of Alma have developed in the way the Lord wanted them to. He can now bring the trial to an end. It's not serving a purpose anymore, and he's going to lead them out of bondage. And we'll have a look at that in just a minute. But let's pause and talk about when adversity comes that's not my fault. Okay, this is things that I didn't cause. How can I handle them all? Here's a big long list, and you can add your own things. I can hush my fears. I can humbly submit to the experience. I can maintain my honor and try and find solutions. I can turn to God in my prayers. I can increase my praying. I can exercise faith, patience, and cheerfulness. I can find solutions, and I can keep my baptismal covenants by comforting and mourning and helping those around me, and on and on and on. You watch where the energy of Alma's people goes, and it's into good things. Instead of feeling sorry for themselves about the trial, they rise to the occasion, and they grow in the directions the Lord's hoping that they will grow in. Now, I'd just like to take a minute and compare. Now, I didn't want to ignore Limhi's people because they're still back in the land of Nephi and Shilom, and they're in bondage as well. They're in a slavery situation the same way as Alma's people. And so here's a chance now with this chart that I've got for you that will allow us to compare the two groups just a little bit. So let's talk about Limhi's group, even though we didn't cover them in great detail. If you look at the column under Limhi's group, you'll see what they went through. The Limhi's group is quite interesting because they really resisted the bondage the first few times it was put there. And they go to battle. And as if you might remember, they have 3 different battles with the Lamanites trying to get themselves out of slavery, and it doesn't go well for them. In none of these battles do they win, and sadly, lots of their men are killed. And then we have women, widows, and families without fathers who finally submit to their bondage, but they really suffer in the meantime. The Lord is slow to hear their cries. Their prayers aren't answered right away because he's hoping they're going to repent. But the Lord eventually comes and softens the Lamanites' hearts. They start prospering by degrees. They actually start helping each other. If you remember, there's men assigned to all these different families to help. And then Gideon conceives of this plan of escape. They get the Lamanite guards drunk. And then Ammon, who came down from King Mosiah II to find them, leads them back to Zarahemla. So that's our Limhi's group. They've had quite a rough time of it, but they're eventually delivered. Now, if you compare their time to what you just studied with Alma's group, remember, they had a Lamanite army to deal with, but nobody fought back. There was no bloodshed. We didn't lose all of our men in the battle. The Lord answered their prayers right away. Remember, he softened the hearts of the Lamanites really quickly, and then later on is answering their prayers. The Lord, through the power of the atonement, physically eased their burdens, and then I also showed you how they're each easing each other's burdens by keeping their baptismal covenants. Lord visits them, they visit each other, and the patience and the faith grows. The Lord then says, I will deliver you. We don't need a plan. And the Lord puts the guards to sleep. We don't have any alcohol involved here. And then the Lord leads them to Zarahemla. Alma's obviously never been to Zarahemla, so he doesn't know how to get there. But the Lord obviously leads him through revelation. So everybody ends up back free of their slavery in Zarahemla, but they get there by very different paths. So it's worth just stopping and considering, how do I respond to my adversity? And how might I learn from these two groups? They get there in very different ways, but they get there. And so maybe I could see that maybe submitting to my trials a little sooner instead of fighting against them would be a wise thing to do. But I can also learn from Gideon of making plans and having more autonomy in that, or relying on the Lord more. So we have 2 different ways to get out of bondage here. Both of them have their value, and I don't want to take away from either experience because each experience is miraculous. Just be aware that you may get out of your trials very differently than someone else, even if you're having the same trial. And so these are such great stories and things that we can learn from with adversity. So I just want to give you a closing principle here of what did you learn from the Limhi-Alma comparison? How will that information help you in your current adversity? Now, we do have times in our lives where there isn't any adversity, and so if you're in one of those nice calm periods where everything's going fine, that's great. But as we know, adversity comes. Sometimes it comes quite unexpectedly. Sometimes it comes a lot, and with a lot of things all at once. So it's best that we be prepared. But I hope that these chapters and looking at these people and their adversity will inspire you on how to respond to adversity. If your adversity is caused by sin or mistakes, we can fix that. And we do it through the power of repentance. And so if you're having any adversity that's related to that, I'd invite you to jump on that and to do your part in the repentance process. If you're having adversity that wasn't caused by you, that's either coming because of mortality or because of other people, I'd invite you to learn from Alma and his people and how to handle that and be able to apply these principles in your life to make your growth experiences more positive, more powerful, and more pleasant for you while they're lasting. I know that God delivers his people. I know that we make covenants so that we can have the assurance that he will come and deliver us. I've had many moments of deliverance in my life, and I'm grateful for those, but I know that I'm going to need more moments of help from the Lord as the future unfolds and adversity continues to come. So I just share my testimony that a covenant relationship with God is the best place to be. And as our prophet has said, covenants make life easier. They don't make life easy, but they certainly help us get through things, as you've watched with Alma. So I just share that testimony with you and do so in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.